The American Civil War occurred between April 12, 1861, and May 26, 1865, and was fought between the Union, representing the northern states, and the Confederacy, formed by southern states that had seceded. The central issue that led to the war was a dispute over whether slavery would be allowed to expand into the western territories. Abraham Lincoln's victory in the 1860 presidential election, with his opposition to slavery's expansion, led to the secession of 7 southern slave states, which formed the Confederacy. The Confederacy seized federal assets within their borders and gained control over a third of the U.S. population in 11 of the 34 U.S. states. The war lasted for 4 years, with most of the combat occurring in the South. The Union made significant gains in the Western theater during 1861 to 1862, but the conflict in the Eastern theater was inconclusive. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln on January 1, 1863, declared all slaves in states in rebellion to be free. Western successes, including the destruction of the Confederates' river navy and armies, and the successful Union siege of Vicksburg, split the Confederacy in two. General Ulysses S. Grant's command of all Union armies in 1864, the Union's naval blockade of Confederate ports, and the fall of Atlanta, followed by Sherman's march to the sea, weakened the Confederacy. The last significant battles occurred around the 10-month siege of Petersburg, leading to the Confederates abandoning Richmond and Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Confederate surrenders continued until June 23, and Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, just 5 days after Lee's surrender. The war ended with the May 26 surrender of the Department of the Trans-Mississippi. The Confederacy collapsed, slavery was abolished, and 4 million enslaved black people were freed. The country entered the Reconstruction era to rebuild the nation, bring the former Confederate states back into the United States, and grant civil rights to freed slaves, as much of the South's infrastructure was destroyed. The Civil War, a highly scrutinized event in U.S. history, continues to generate cultural and historiographical controversy, notably regarding the enduring myth of the lost cause of the Confederacy. This war marked one of the earliest instances of industrial warfare, characterized by the widespread use of railroads, telegraph, steamships, ironclad warships, and mass-produced weapons. The conflict resulted in an unprecedented number of casualties, with estimates ranging from 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers and an indeterminate number of civilian deaths, making it the deadliest military encounter in American history. The advanced technology and brutality of the Civil War also served as a precursor to the global conflicts of the 20th century. The reasons for the secession of Southern states are complex and have been a subject of historical controversy. However, most scholars agree that slavery was the main cause of the American Civil War. Some historical revisionists have tried to suggest other reasons for the war, further complicating the issue. Political tension had been escalating due to slavery in the 1850s, with the Republican Party determined to prevent its spread to the territories. This would have given the North more representation in Congress and the Electoral College after these territories became states. Many Southern leaders had threatened to secede if Lincoln won the 1860 election. When he did win, many Southern leaders felt that disunion was their only option, fearing that they would lose representation and the ability to enact pro-slavery laws and policies. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln acknowledged that slavery was the central and powerful interest that was somehow the cause of the war. The Confederacy wanted to strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest, while the Union government claimed no right to do more than restrict its territorial enlargement. The primary cause of disunion and the ensuing war was the contentious issue of slavery, which had been a source of controversy since the Constitution was drafted. Despite compromises, the issue continued to divide the nation into a slave-holding South and a free North, especially as the country expanded territorially. Attempts to resolve the issue through legislation, such as the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, only postponed the inevitable showdown over slavery that would lead to the Civil War. Although the motivations of individual soldiers varied, Unionists increasingly supported the abolition of slavery as the war progressed, while Confederate soldiers fought to protect a Southern society that relied heavily on slavery. Opponents of slavery viewed it as a moral evil and incompatible with republicanism, while the strategy of anti-slavery forces was to contain its expansion and ultimately lead to its demise. However, Southern whites feared that emancipation would destroy their economy, as it was heavily dependent on slave labor, and were also concerned about the potential for a violent slave rebellion like the one that occurred in Haiti. This fear was exacerbated by John Brown's attempt to incite a slave rebellion in 1859. The phrase "a disease in the public mind," used by critics of anti-slavery sentiment, may have contributed to the segregation in the Jim Crow era following emancipation, according to historian Thomas Fleming. Abolitionists, who sought to end slavery, were active in the years leading up to the Civil War. Their philosophical roots can be traced back to the Puritans, who believed that slavery was morally wrong. Samuel Sewall's 1700 work, The Selling of Joseph, was one of the early Puritan writings that condemned slavery and the slave trade and challenged the justifications for it. The American Revolution and the cause of liberty gave the abolitionist movement great momentum. Slavery, which had been accepted as normal for thousands of years, became a pressing issue during and after the Revolution. Northern states quickly began outlawing slavery, and even Southern states changed laws to limit it and promote manumission. The number of indentured servants decreased significantly throughout the country. The act prohibiting importation of slaves was passed with little opposition in Congress, and President Thomas Jefferson supported it. It went into effect on January 1, 1808, the first day that the Constitution allowed Congress to ban the importation of slaves. Manumission societies were founded by Benjamin Franklin and James Madison. Many slave owners were influenced by the Revolution and freed their slaves, but others, like George Washington, only did so in their wills. As a result of these actions, the proportion of free black people in the Upper South increased from less than 1% to almost 10% between 1790 and 1810. The establishment of the Northwest Territory as free soil with no slavery by Manasseh Cutler and Rufus Putnam, both from Puritan New England, was also crucial. This territory, which included the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, doubled the size of the United States. The years leading up to the Civil War saw a surge in abolitionist activity, with figures such as Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Frederick Douglass using the country's Puritan heritage to bolster their cause. The Liberator, the most radical anti-slavery newspaper, referenced the Puritans and their values over 1,000 times. Parker, in his efforts to persuade New England congressmen to support abolition, declared that the son of the Puritan is sent to Congress to stand up for truth and right. Literature was also employed to spread the message, with works such as 12 Years a Slave. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, American Slavery as It Is, and the best-selling book of the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Hinton Rowan Helper, an unusual abolitionist due to his virulent racism and Southern background, wrote The Impending Crisis of the South, How to Meet It in 1857, which had an impact comparable to that of Uncle Tom's Cabin in fueling sectional controversy prior to the Civil War. Helper argued that slavery was impeding the progress and prosperity of the South, sinking its commerce and citizens into poverty and ignorance. By 1840, over 15,000 people had joined abolitionist societies in the United States. Abolitionism became a popular expression of moralism and directly contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. Reformers advocated for an absolute and immediate rejection of slavery through churches, conventions, and newspapers, although support for abolition was not universal among the religious. As the war approached, even the main denominations split along political lines, forming rival Southern and Northern churches. The Whig Party became increasingly opposed to slavery, seeing it as antithetical to the ideals of capitalism and the free market. William H. Seward, a Whig leader and future Secretary of State under Lincoln, argued that slavery created an irrepressible conflict between slave labor and free labor and held the South back in development. As the Whig Party dissolved in the 1850s, its successor, the Republican Party, took up the mantle of abolitionism. The concept of manifest destiny played a significant role in the escalation of the conflict over slavery. With each new territory acquired by the United States between 1803 and 1854 through purchase, negotiation, or conquest, the thorny issue of whether to allow or prohibit slavery had to be addressed. Initially, the new states formed from these territories were evenly divided between slave and free states, leading to clashes between pro- and anti-slavery forces over the western territories beyond the Mississippi. The Mexican-American War and its aftermath were pivotal events in the lead-up to the Civil War. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo finalized the conquest of northern Mexico in 1848, slaveholders anticipated expanding into these lands and potentially into Cuba and Central America. Ralph Waldo Emerson presciently warned that Mexico will poison us due to the ensuing conflicts over whether the newly acquired territories would be slave or free. Northern free soil interests worked tirelessly to limit any further expansion of slave territory. The Compromise of 1850, which balanced the admission of a free soil state, California, with a stronger federal fugitive slave law, provided a political settlement after years of strife in the 1840s. However, the states admitted after California, such as Minnesota, 1858, Oregon, 1859, and Kansas, 1861, were all free. In the southern states, the issue of westward territorial expansion of slavery once again became a source of tension. Both the North and the South realized that the power to decide the question of slavery for the territories was the power to determine the future of slavery itself. By the year 1860, there were four distinct doctrines that had emerged regarding federal control over the territories, all claiming to have the Constitution's sanction, either implicitly or explicitly. The first of these theories was represented by the Constitutional Union Party, which argued that the Missouri Compromise's division of territory into free soil in the North and slavery in the South should become a constitutional mandate. This view was reflected in the failed Crittenden Compromise of 1860. The second doctrine was that of congressional preeminence, championed by Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. It held that legislators were not bound by the Constitution to maintain a policy of balance, and that slavery could be excluded in a territory, as it was in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, at Congress's discretion. According to this doctrine, Congress could restrict slavery, but never establish it. The ill-fated Wilmot Proviso first announced this position in 1846, and its support by Northern Democrats and Whigs, and opposition by Southerners, foreshadowed coming divisions. The third doctrine, territorial or popular sovereignty, was proclaimed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. It asserted that settlers in a territory had the same rights as states in the Union to allow or disallow slavery as a purely local matter. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 reflected this doctrine, leading to the Bleeding Kansas conflict between pro- and anti-slavery supporters. The U.S. House of Representatives voted to admit Kansas as a free state in early 1860, but its admission did not pass the Senate until January 1861, after the departure of Southern senators. The fourth doctrine was state sovereignty, also known as the Calhoun Doctrine, advocated by Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis. Rejecting arguments for federal authority or self-government, state sovereignty empowered states to promote slavery's expansion as part of the federal union under the U.S. Constitution. These four doctrines presented the dominant ideologies regarding slavery, the territories, and the U.S. Constitution to the American public before the 1860 presidential election. The extent to which states' rights triggered the Civil War has been a long-running dispute. While popular accounts of the war frequently reference this issue, the consensus among historians is that the Civil War was not fought over states' rights. Southerners advocating secession argued that a state had the right to secede from the Union at any time, but Northerners rejected this idea as contrary to the will of the Founding Fathers, who intended to establish a perpetual Union. Although some Confederates genuinely believed they were fighting for states' rights, historian James McPherson points out that it ultimately boiled down to the states' right to slavery. The idea of states' rights was formulated and applied as a means of advancing slave state interests through federal authority. The Southern states supported the use of federal powers to enforce and extend slavery before the Civil War, such as through the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott v. Sandford decision. The demand for federal slave protection represented a demand for an unprecedented expansion of federal power. Many Northerners, even non-abolitionists, feared the slave power conspiracy due to the overrepresentation of pro-slavery factions in the federal government. Some Northern states even resisted the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Historian Eric Foner notes that the act could hardly have been designed to arouse greater opposition in the North. According to historian Paul Finkelman, the Southern states mostly complained that the Northern states were asserting their states' rights and that the national government was not powerful enough to counter these Northern claims. The Confederate Constitution even federally required slavery to be legal in all Confederate states and claimed territories. Overall, the idea of states' rights was a means to advance the interest of slavery rather than a principle worth fighting for on its own. The North and South were characterized by different economies, social structures, customs, and political values, which led to sectionalism. The tensions between the regions were highlighted during the War of 1812, resulting in the Hartford Convention, which reflected Northern dissatisfaction with issues such as a foreign trade embargo that disproportionately affected the industrial North, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the dilution of Northern power by new states, and a succession of Southern presidents. From 1800 to 1860, sectionalism steadily increased as the North phased out slavery, industrialized, urbanized, and built prosperous farms, while the Deep South concentrated on plantation agriculture based on slave labor and subsistence agriculture for poor whites. During the 1840s and 1850s, the nation's largest religious denominations, including the Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches, split into separate Northern and Southern denominations over the issue of accepting slavery, under the guise of rejecting slave-owning bishops and missionaries. While some historians have argued that economic differences played a role in causing the war, most now disagree with the economic determinism of historian Charles A. Beard in the 1920s. Instead, they emphasize that the Northern and Southern economies were largely complementary and mutually beneficial despite their social differences. The owners of slaves favored inexpensive manual labor without the use of machinery. Meanwhile, Northern manufacturing interests advocated for tariffs and protectionism, whereas Southern plantation owners demanded free trade. Throughout the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the Democrats in Congress, who were largely from the South, drafted the tariff laws and continually reduced rates. By 1857, the rates were at their lowest since 1816. During the 1860 election, the Republicans called for an increase in tariffs, which were only implemented in 1861 after Southerners resigned from Congress. While the tariff issue was a Northern concern, neo-Confederate writers have attempted to present it as a Southern grievance. However, during the attempts to prevent secession in 1860 to 1861, none of the compromise proposals included the tariff issue. Moreover, pamphlets from both the North and South rarely referenced the tariff as a major issue. In the early 19th century, nationalism was a potent force, championed by figures such as Andrew Jackson and Daniel Webster. While the vast majority of Northerners were in favor of the Union, Southerners were divided between those who remained loyal to the entirety of the United States, known as Southern Unionists, and those who were primarily devoted to the South and later the Confederacy. Southerners perceived certain actions as insults to their collective honor, such as the immense popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin and abolitionist John Brown's attempt to incite a slave rebellion in 1859. As the South gravitated towards Southern nationalism, Northern leaders were also becoming more nationally minded, rejecting any idea of dividing the Union. The Republican electoral platform in 1860 emphasized that disunion was treason and would not be tolerated. Despite these warnings, the South persisted in their secessionist efforts, failing to comprehend the North's unwavering commitment to preserving the Union. The secession of Southern states was ultimately sparked by the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860. Southern leaders were concerned that Lincoln would work to halt the expansion of slavery and lead to its eventual demise. Despite the fact that Lincoln would not be inaugurated until 5 months after the election, the South saw this as an opportunity to secede and prepare for war during the winter and spring of 1861. Lincoln believed that the American people had demonstrated their ability to establish and govern a republic successfully. However, the nation faced a third challenge of maintaining a republic that was built on the principle of the people's vote and withstanding efforts to dismantle it. The election of Lincoln in 1860 prompted South Carolina's legislature to convene a state convention to consider secession. South Carolina had long championed the idea that states had the right to nullify federal laws and secede from the United States. On December 20, 1860, the convention unanimously voted to secede and issued a declaration that argued for states' rights for slave owners in the South, but also criticized Northern states for not fulfilling their federal obligations under the Constitution, particularly with regards to the Fugitive Slave Act. Other Southern states, including Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, also seceded in the following months. Some states specifically mentioned the threat to slave-holding states posed by Northern abolitionists in their ordinances of secession, while others simply announced the dissolution of ties with the Union. South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas passed detailed explanations of their reasons for secession, all of which blamed the movement to abolish slavery and its influence on Northern politics. The Southern states believed that slaveholding was a constitutional right under the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. They formed the Confederate States of America on February 4, 1861, and took control of federal forts and properties within their boundaries with little resistance from outgoing President James Buchanan. Buchanan argued that the Dred Scott decision proved that the South had no grounds for secession, and that the Union was intended to be perpetual. However, he also believed that Congress did not have the power to use force to compel a state to remain in the Union. In February 1861, 1/4 of the U.S. Army, including the entire garrison in Texas, was surrendered to state forces by General David E. Twiggs, who then joined the Confederacy. After Southerners resigned from Congress, the Republican-controlled legislature was able to pass various projects that had been blocked by Southern senators before the Civil War. These included the Morrill Tariff, land-grant colleges, the Morrill Act, a Homestead Act, a transcontinental railroad, the Pacific Railroad Acts, the National Bank Act, the authorization of United States notes by the Legal Tender Act of 1862. And the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. To help finance the war, the Revenue Act of 1861 introduced the income tax. In December 1860, the Crittenden Compromise was proposed as a way to restore the Missouri Compromise line by constitutionally banning slavery in territories to the north of the line while guaranteeing it to the south. The adoption of this compromise might have prevented the secession of the Southern states, but it was rejected by Lincoln and the Republicans. Lincoln stated that any compromise that extended slavery would eventually bring down the Union. In February 1861, a peace conference was held in Washington, which proposed a solution similar to that of the Crittenden Compromise, but it was rejected by Congress. The Republicans offered an alternative compromise that did not interfere with slavery where it existed, but the South regarded it as inadequate. Despite this, the remaining 8 slave states rejected pleas to join the Confederacy after a 2-1 no vote in Virginia's first secessionist convention on April 4, 1861. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president on March 4, 1861. During his inaugural address, he emphasized that the Constitution was a stronger union than the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, and that any attempt to secede was legally void. He clarified that he had no plans to invade Southern states or to abolish slavery where it existed. But he would use force to retain federal property, including forts, arsenals, mints, and custom houses that had been seized by the Southern states. Lincoln stated that the government would not attempt to recover post offices, and if resisted, mail delivery would stop at state lines. If federal law could not be peacefully enforced, U.S. Marshals and judges would be removed. Lincoln did not mention the bullion that was lost from U.S. mints in Louisiana, Georgia, and North Carolina. He announced that the U.S. would only collect import duties at its ports, and that there was no legitimate reason for the South to revolt during his administration. In closing, he made an appeal for the restoration of the Union, urging the mystic cords of memory that bound the two regions. The government of the Confederacy, led by Jefferson Davis, sent 3 representatives to Washington to negotiate a peace treaty with the United States. However, Lincoln refused to negotiate with Confederate agents, arguing that the Confederacy was not a legitimate government, and that any treaty would amount to recognition of the Confederacy as a sovereign entity. Instead, Lincoln attempted to negotiate with the governors of individual seceded states, recognizing their administrations as legitimate. William Seward, the new Secretary of State, complicated Lincoln's efforts to resolve the crisis. Seward had been Lincoln's main rival for the Republican presidential nomination and only agreed to support Lincoln after being promised a position of great power. In the early days of Lincoln's presidency, Seward considered himself the de facto head of government and attempted to engage in unauthorized negotiations that proved unsuccessful. Despite this, Lincoln was determined to maintain control of all Union-occupied forts in the Confederacy, including Fort Monroe in Virginia, Fort Pickens, Fort Jefferson, and Fort Taylor in Florida, and Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Seward's perceived lack of respect for Lincoln due to his perceived inexperience also created tensions between the two men. The beginning of the American Civil War occurred on April 12, 1861, with Confederate forces initiating an attack on Fort Sumter, a Union-held fort located in the Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. The fort's status had been disputed for several months, with President Buchanan failing to reinforce the Union garrison commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Anderson decided to take matters into his own hands and moved the garrison to the more defensible Fort Sumter on December 26, 1860, which made him a hero in the North. An attempt to resupply the fort on January 9, 1861, failed, but an informal truce prevented the conflict from escalating. However, by March 1861, Lincoln was informed that the fort was running low on supplies. Secretary of State Seward attempted to negotiate a withdrawal from the fort with the Confederates, but Lincoln overruled him, and Seward became one of Lincoln's staunchest allies. Lincoln decided that reinforcing and holding the fort was the only feasible option, and on April 6, he informed the governor of South Carolina that a ship with only food but no ammunition would attempt to resupply the fort. Historian McPherson regarded this approach as the first sign of the mastery that would mark Lincoln's presidency, as it put the Confederates in a difficult position. If they opened fire on an unarmed supply ship, they would be seen as the aggressor. On April 9, the Confederate cabinet met, and President Davis ordered General P.G. T. Beauregard to take the fort before supplies could reach it. Confederate forces commenced their attack on Fort Sumter at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, unleashing a barrage of 4,000 shells that forced the Union to surrender the next day. The loss of the fort galvanized the North, and on April 15, President Lincoln issued a call to arms for 75,000 volunteer troops to serve for 90 days. Patriotic Union states quickly met the quota. Lincoln followed up with another call for 42,000 volunteers to serve for 3 years on May 3, 1861. However, the situation grew more complicated when Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. In a gesture to honor Virginia's decision, the Confederate capital was moved to Richmond. Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky were states with divided loyalties during the Civil War due to their status as slave states and the presence of family members and businesses on both sides of the conflict. This resulted in some men enlisting in the Union Army and others in the Confederate Army. West Virginia separated from Virginia and joined the Union on June 20, 1863. Maryland's location around Washington, D.C., made it strategically important, and it had many officials who opposed Lincoln and tolerated anti-army rioting in Baltimore, including the burning of bridges to hinder troop movements to the south. Despite the state legislature's overwhelming vote, 53-13, to remain in the Union, it also rejected hostilities with the South and voted to close its rail lines to prevent their use in the war. In response, Lincoln declared martial law, suspended habeas corpus, and sent in militia units from the north to take control of Maryland and the District of Columbia. He even arrested prominent figures, including one-third of the members of the Maryland General Assembly on the day it reconvened, holding them without trial in defiance of a ruling by Chief Justice Roger Taney on June 1, 1861. That only Congress had the power to suspend habeas corpus, ex parte Merriman. Federal troops also imprisoned a Baltimore newspaper editor, Frank Key Howard, who was the grandson of Francis Scott Key, after he criticized Lincoln in an editorial for ignoring Taney's ruling. In Missouri, a secession convention voted to remain in the Union. However, when Governor Claiborne F. Jackson called out the state militia in support of the Confederacy, federal forces under General Nathaniel Lyon attacked them and chased the governor and his state guard to the southwestern corner of the state. See also, Missouri secession. In the ensuing power vacuum, the convention reconvened and took control as the Unionist Provisional Government of Missouri. Kentucky initially declared neutrality but did not secede. When Confederate forces entered the state in September 1861, the state reaffirmed its Union status while still maintaining slavery. During a brief Confederate invasion in 1861, sympathizers organized a secession convention, formed the shadow Confederate government of Kentucky, and gained recognition from the Confederacy. Its jurisdiction only extended as far as Confederate battle lines in the state, and it went into exile after October 1862. Following Virginia's secession, a Unionist government in Wheeling asked 48 counties to vote on an ordinance to create a new state on October 24, 1861. The statehood bill was approved by 96% of voters, with a turnout of 34%. The new state included 24 secessionist counties, and the ensuing guerrilla war involved around 40,000 federal troops. Congress admitted West Virginia to the Union on June 20, 1863, and it provided soldiers to both the Confederacy and the Union. There was also a Unionist secession attempt in East Tennessee, which was suppressed by the Confederacy. Over 3,000 men suspected of being loyal to the Union were arrested and held without trial. The American Civil War was characterized by its intensity and frequency of battle. Over a span of 4 years, 237 named battles took place along with numerous minor actions and skirmishes, resulting in high casualties. British historian John Keegan, in his book The American Civil War, describes it as one of the most ferocious wars ever fought. Often, without clear geographic objectives, each side's primary target was the enemy's soldier. At the start of the Confederacy's formation in Montgomery, the U.S. Army had a meager count of 16,000 soldiers. Nevertheless, Northern governors had already begun to mobilize their militias in response. The Confederate Congress authorized the enlistment of up to 100,000 troops as early as February, with Jefferson Davis later advocating for 100,000 soldiers for 1 year or the duration of the war. The U.S. Congress responded with a similar call for troops by May. During the first year of the war, both sides had an influx of volunteers that surpassed their ability to train and equip effectively. However, this initial enthusiasm eventually waned, and both sides turned to conscription to encourage or compel more volunteers. Relatively few were drafted and served, as most soldiers were still volunteers. The Confederacy passed a draft law in April 1862, applying to men aged 18 to 35, with exceptions for overseers of slaves, government officials, and clergymen. In July of the same year, the U.S. Congress authorized a militia draft when states could not meet their quota with volunteers. The Union Army also saw significant enlistment from European immigrants, with 177,000 soldiers born in Germany and 144,000 born in Ireland. When the Emancipation Proclamation was put into effect in January 1863, the states began to energetically recruit ex-slaves to meet their quotas. White volunteers were also sought, and states and local communities offered higher and higher cash bonuses to attract them. In March 1863, Congress tightened the law, allowing drafted men to provide substitutes or pay commutation money until mid-1864. Many eligible men pooled their money to cover the cost of anyone drafted. Families used the substitute provision to decide which man would go to the army and which would stay home. There was much evasion and overt resistance to the draft, especially in Catholic areas. The draft riot in New York City in July 1863 involved Irish immigrants who had been signed up as citizens to swell the vote of the city's democratic political machine, not realizing it made them liable for the draft. Of the 168,649 men procured for the Union through the draft, 117,986 were substitutes, leaving only 50,663 who had their services conscripted. The draft laws were highly unpopular in both the North and South. In the North, around 120,000 men evaded conscription, with many fleeing to Canada. Additionally, 280,000 soldiers deserted during the war. At least 100,000 Southerners deserted, or about 10% of the Confederate forces. One historian writing in 1991 explained that Southern desertion was high because of the highly localized Southern identity, which meant that many Southern men had little investment in the outcome of the war. Individual soldiers cared more about the fate of their local area than any grand ideal. In the North, bounty jumpers enlisted to get the generous bonus, deserted, and then went back to a second recruiting station under a different name to sign up again for a second bonus. A total of 141 were caught and executed. From a tiny frontier force in 1860, the Union and Confederate armies had grown into the largest and most efficient armies in the world within a few years. Some European observers at the time dismissed them as amateur and unprofessional, but historian John Keegan concluded that each outmatched the French, Prussian, and Russian armies of the time, and without the Atlantic, would have threatened any of them with defeat. During the early stages of the Civil War, a parole system was established in which prisoners agreed not to engage in combat until they were formally exchanged. These captives were held in camps under the authority of their respective armies, where they received payment but were prohibited from performing military duties. However, the exchange system broke down in 1863 when the Confederacy refused to exchange black prisoners. As a result, roughly 56,000 out of the 409,000 prisoners of war perished in prisons during the war, comprising nearly 10% of the total fatalities of the conflict. According to historian Elizabeth D. Leonard, between 500 and 1,000 women disguised themselves as men and enlisted as soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. Additionally, women served as spies, resistance activists, nurses, and hospital personnel, with some serving on the Union hospital ship Red Rover and caring for troops from both sides. One notable woman who served in the Union Army was Mary Edwards Walker, who received the Medal of Honor for her efforts in treating wounded soldiers during the war. However, her name was removed from the Army Medal of Honor roll in 1917, along with over 900 other recipients, before being restored in 1977. According to historian Elizabeth D. Leonard, between 500 and 1,000 women disguised themselves as men and enlisted as soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. Additionally, women served as spies, resistance activists, nurses, and hospital personnel, with some serving on the Union hospital ship Red Rover and caring for Union and Confederate troops. Mary Edwards Walker, a Union Army member, received the Medal of Honor for her exceptional work treating wounded soldiers during the war. Although her name, along with over 900 other Medal of Honor recipients, was removed from the Army Medal of Honor roll in 1917, it was reinstated in 1977. During the Civil War, the U.S. Navy rapidly expanded from a small force to a fleet of 671 vessels with over 6,000 officers and 45,000 sailors by 1865. The Navy's objectives included blockading Confederate ports, controlling the river system, protecting against Confederate raiders on the high seas, and preparing for a possible war with the British Royal Navy. The West became the site of the main Riverine War, as control of the Red, Tennessee, Cumberland, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers was critical to gaining access to the Confederate heartland. In the East, the Navy provided support for coastal Army operations and shelled Confederate forts. The Civil War took place during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and many naval innovations emerged during this time. The Confederacy responded to the Union blockade by building or converting over 130 vessels, including 26 ironclads and floating batteries, half of which saw active service. These vessels were equipped with ram bows, causing ram fever among Union squadrons wherever they threatened. However, the Confederacy was ultimately unsuccessful in their efforts against the overwhelming Union naval superiority and the Union's ironclad warships. In addition to ocean-going warships, the Union Navy employed timber-clads, tincture-lads, and armored gunboats to secure control of the Mississippi. Shipyards in Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis were instrumental in constructing new boats and converting steamboats for naval action. The Confederacy, on the other hand, experimented with new technologies, such as the submarine CSS Hunley, which failed to work effectively, and the ironclad ship, CSS Virginia, which was constructed by rebuilding a sunken Union ship, the Merrimac. During its first engagement on March 8, 1862, Virginia dealt significant damage to the Union's wooden fleet. However, the next day, the first Union ironclad, USS Monitor, arrived in the Chesapeake Bay to challenge Virginia. The resulting 3-hour Battle of Hampton Roads ended in a stalemate, but it proved the effectiveness of ironclad warships. Shortly after the battle, the Confederacy was forced to scuttle Virginia to prevent its capture, while the Union went on to build many more copies of the Monitor. Despite their efforts, the Confederacy lacked the technological know-how and infrastructure to produce effective warships. Thus, they attempted to acquire warships from Great Britain, but were unsuccessful. Great Britain had no interest in selling warships to a nation that was at war with a stronger enemy, and doing so could damage relations with the U.S. In the early stages of the Civil War, General Winfield Scott formulated the Anaconda Plan, aimed at achieving victory with minimal bloodshed. The plan involved blockading the Confederacy and gradually depriving the South of resources until they surrendered. While President Lincoln adopted some aspects of the plan, he pursued a more aggressive approach to the war effort. In April 1861, Lincoln declared a Union blockade of all Southern ports, leading to the cessation of commercial shipping and the end of regular trade. The Confederacy made the mistake of embargoing cotton exports before the blockade became effective, and by the time they realized their error, it was too late. The South was unable to export more than 10% of its cotton, and the blockade effectively shut down Confederate ports such as New Orleans, Mobile, and Charleston, which were critical railheads for moving cotton. By June 1861, Union warships were stationed off the major southern ports, and a year later, almost 300 ships were deployed in service. At the outbreak of the Civil War, the Confederacy faced a shortage of military supplies, particularly arms, which the predominantly agricultural South could not produce in sufficient quantities. Northern arms manufacturers were restricted by an embargo on arms, preventing shipments from going to the Confederacy and ending existing and future contracts. Therefore, the Confederacy looked to foreign sources to meet its enormous military needs, such as S. Isaac, Campbell and Company and the London Armoury Company in Britain. These companies acted as purchasing agents, connecting the Confederacy with British arms manufacturers, ultimately becoming their primary source of arms. To safely transport arms to the Confederacy, British investors constructed small, fast steam-driven blockade runners that traded arms and supplies brought in from Britain through Bermuda, Cuba, and the Bahamas in exchange for high-priced cotton. These ships were lightweight and designed for speed, capable of carrying only a relatively small amount of cotton back to England. When the Union Navy seized a blockade runner, the ship and cargo were seized as a prize of war and sold, with the proceeds given to the Navy sailors. The captured crewmen were mostly British and were later released. During the Civil War, the Southern economy suffered greatly due to various factors such as the scarcity of food supplies, the failure of Southern railroads, and foraging by Northern armies, among others. The loss of control of main rivers and the seizure of animals and crops by Confederate armies also contributed to the economic collapse. While many historians attribute the major cause of the ruin to the blockade, Wise argues that the blockade runners provided a crucial lifeline to General Lee, allowing him to continue fighting for several additional months by providing fresh supplies of 400,000 rifles, lead, blankets, and boots that the home front economy could no longer supply. On the other hand, Serdam argues that the blockade was a powerful weapon that eventually ruined the Southern economy at a low cost of lives in combat. The Confederate cotton crop was practically useless, and critical imports were scarce, which led to the end of the coastal trade as well. The success of the blockade was measured not by the few ships that were able to evade it, but by the thousands that never attempted to do so. European-owned merchant ships could not get insurance and were too slow to escape the blockade, which led to the cessation of their calls at Confederate ports. The Confederacy sought to wage an offensive war by purchasing ships in Britain, converting them into warships, and raiding American merchant ships in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This led to skyrocketing insurance rates and the near disappearance of the American flag from international waters. However, these same ships were REFLAG'd with European flags and continued their operations without interference. Following the war's end, the U.S. government demanded that Britain compensate them for the damages inflicted by these raiders outfitted in British ports. Britain ultimately agreed to the demand, paying $15 million to the U.S. in 1871. Additionally, Dinkaslan argues that the blockade's impact led to the rise of oil as a widely traded and used commodity. The whale oil industry was already in decline, and many of the old whaling ships were used in blockade efforts like the Stone Fleet. Confederate raiders also harassed Union whalers, exacerbating the situation. Kerosene and other oil products, which were previously used mainly as lubricants, began to replace whale oil in lamps and emerged as a fuel commodity. This increased the significance of oil as a commodity, even before its eventual use as fuel for combustion engines. The Confederacy's initial hope of gaining military aid from Britain and France in their fight against the Union proved unattainable, and they instead sought their involvement as mediators. However, Lincoln and Seward worked to prevent this and threatened war if any country recognized the Confederate States of America. In an attempt to force Britain into the war, Southerners embargoed cotton shipments in 1861, but this strategy failed as Europe turned to other sources for cotton. This hindered the South's recovery after the war, and cotton diplomacy ultimately proved to be a failure, further turning European opinion against the Confederacy. The North's grain exports became increasingly critical during the 1860–62 crop failures in Europe, giving rise to the saying that King Corn was more powerful than King Cotton. This shift in trade also helped to reduce Europe's reliance on southern cotton, further hindering the Confederacy's economic recovery after the war. However, the war did provide employment opportunities for arms manufacturers, iron workers, and shipping companies that transported weapons. Initially, Lincoln's administration failed to win over European public opinion. Their diplomats focused on legalistic arguments about the unconstitutionality of secession, rather than appealing to the issue of slavery. In contrast, Confederate representatives were successful in framing their struggle as a fight for liberty, free trade, and the importance of cotton to the European economy. This led to European aristocracy proclaiming the American experiment in popular government as a failure, while government leaders welcomed the fragmentation of the American Republic. However, the Union sought to connect with the international press to appeal to the liberal sensibilities of the European public. Union diplomats, such as Carl Schurz, recognized that emphasizing the war against slavery was the Union's most effective moral asset in winning over public opinion in Europe. While Seward was concerned about distressing European merchants with cotton interests, he still supported a widespread campaign of public diplomacy for the Union cause. Charles Francis Adams, the U.S. minister to Britain, played a key role in persuading Britain not to openly challenge the Union blockade, despite the Confederacy's purchase of several warships from British shipbuilders, including the infamous CSS Alabama. This ship and others did considerable damage to Union forces and led to post-war disputes. However, the powerful anti-slavery movement in Britain created a political liability for British politicians. In late 1861, war between the U.S. and Britain seemed imminent following the Trent Affair, in which U.S. Navy personnel seized 2 Confederate diplomats from the British ship Trent. However, Lincoln released the diplomats, and London and Washington were able to resolve the situation without conflict. Prince Albert even interrupted his deathbed to issue diplomatic instructions to Lord Lyons, which helped to avert British involvement in the war. In 1862, the British government considered mediating between the Union and Confederacy, but such an offer would have risked war with the United States. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston reportedly read Uncle Tom's Cabin multiple times while considering his decision on the matter. The Union's success at the Battle of Antietam caused the British to postpone their decision on whether to support the Confederacy. Over time, the Emancipation Proclamation further reinforced the political cost of backing the Confederacy. France, seeking to take advantage of the Union's preoccupation with the Civil War, invaded Mexico in 1861, prompting protests from Washington over its violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Despite some sympathy for the Confederacy, France's actions ultimately deterred it from entering the war. Later offers by the Confederacy to end slavery in exchange for recognition were not seriously considered by London or Paris. The Polish revolt against Russia in 1863 further distracted the European powers and kept them neutral. Russia, on the other hand, supported the Union because it saw the U.S. as a counterbalance to its rival, the United Kingdom. In fact, the Russian Navy's Baltic and Pacific fleets wintered in American ports in 1863, with New York and San Francisco being their respective destinations. The Eastern Theater encompasses military operations east of the Appalachian Mountains, including Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, the District of Columbia, and North Carolina's coastal fortifications and seaports. In the Union Army of the Potomac, Major General George B. McClellan assumed command on July 26, 1861, and led the main thrust towards Richmond, Virginia, while other forces advanced through Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Mississippi River. The primary Confederate force in the Eastern Theater was the Army of Northern Virginia. The Army originated as the Confederate Army of the Potomac, which merged with other operational forces in Northern Virginia, the Shenandoah, and the Peninsula. Its final name was given by Robert E. Lee when he assumed command on June 1, 1862, although the name Army of Northern Virginia may have originated informally from its parent department's name. Jeb Stuart was eventually appointed to command the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry after being assigned to command all the cavalry companies of the Army of the Shenandoah by Colonel Thomas J. Jackson at Harper's Ferry on July 4. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, occurred in July 1861 and was one of the first major battles of the American Civil War. Union troops under the command of Major General Irvin McDowell marched on Confederate forces led by General P.G.T. Beauregard near Washington. Initially, the Union had the advantage and nearly pushed the Confederates into a rout, but reinforcements under Joseph E. Johnston arrived, and a brigade of Virginians led by the relatively unknown Brigadier General from the Virginia Military Institute, Thomas J. Jackson, held their ground, earning Jackson his famous nickname, Stonewall. In the spring of 1862, President Lincoln urged Major General George B. McClellan to begin offensive operations, leading to the Peninsula Campaign in which McClellan attacked Virginia by way of the peninsula between the York and James Rivers, southeast of Richmond. McClellan's army reached the gates of Richmond but was ultimately defeated. At the same time, Stonewall Jackson led his Valley Campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, employing audacity and rapid movements to successfully engage and prevent three Union armies from reinforcing the Union offensive against Richmond. Jackson's men marched 646 miles in 48 days and earned the nickname Foot Cavalry. Johnston halted McClellan's advance at the Battle of Seven Pines, but he was wounded, and Robert E. Lee assumed command. Lee and his subordinates James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson defeated McClellan in the 7 days battles and forced his retreat. The South emerged victorious once again in the Northern Virginia campaign, which included the Second Battle of Bull Run. Despite General-in-Chief Halleck's orders to send reinforcements to John Pope's Union Army of Virginia, McClellan resisted, making it easier for Lee's Confederates to defeat twice the number of combined enemy troops. This emboldened the Confederacy to make their first invasion of the North during the Maryland Campaign, with General Lee leading 45,000 troops of the Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River into Maryland on September 5. Lincoln then restored Pope's troops to McClellan, and the two forces clashed at the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, resulting in the bloodiest single day in United States military history. Lee's army was checked, and although it returned to Virginia before McClellan could destroy it, Antietam is considered a Union victory because it halted Lee's invasion of the North and provided an opportunity for Lincoln to announce his Emancipation Proclamation. McClellan's failure to follow up on Antietam led to his replacement by Major General Ambrose Burnside, who suffered defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862. Burnside was replaced by Major General Joseph Hooker, who proved unable to defeat Lee's army despite outnumbering them by more than 2-1. His Chancellorsville campaign was ineffective, and he was humiliated in the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, which is known as Lee's perfect battle due to his risky decision to divide his army, resulting in a significant Confederate victory. During the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Stonewall Jackson was shot in the arm by accidental friendly fire and subsequently died of complications. Lee famously said, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." During the Battle of Chancellorsville, the most intense fighting and the second deadliest day of the Civil War occurred on May 3. Lee launched several attacks against the Union position while John Sedgwick defeated a small Confederate force at Marye's Heights in the Second Battle of Fredericksburg and then moved westward. The Confederates were able to delay Sedgwick's advance at the Battle of Salem Church. In June, Major General George Meade replaced Hooker as Lee launched his second invasion of the North. Meade defeated Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg, which is considered the turning point of the war and the bloodiest battle. Pickett's charge on July 3 is often regarded as the high-water mark of the Confederacy, as it signaled the end of their hopes for victory. Lee's army suffered 28,000 casualties, while Meade's losses were 23,000. The Western Theater encompasses military operations that took place between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, encompassing various states such as Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, Kentucky, South Carolina, Tennessee, and parts of Louisiana. Two of the primary Union forces in the Western Theater were the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Cumberland, which were named after the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, respectively. Following an inconclusive fall campaign led by Meade, Lincoln shifted his focus to the Western Theater for new leadership. In the meantime, the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg fell to Union forces, resulting in the permanent isolation of the Western Confederacy and the emergence of Ulysses S. Grant as the new leader that Lincoln was seeking. The Army of Tennessee served as the primary Confederate force in the Western Theater, formed on November 20, 1862, after General Braxton Bragg renamed the former Army of Mississippi. While the Confederacy achieved numerous victories in the Eastern Theater, they faced several defeats in the West. The Union's primary strategist and tactician in the West was Ulysses S. Grant, who earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant after securing victories at Forts Henry, February 6, 1862, and Donelson, February 11–16, 1862. Grant's victories enabled the Union to gain control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Despite Nathan Bedford Forrest's efforts to rally Confederate troops and lead them across the Cumberland, Nashville, and Central Tennessee fell to the Union, leading to the attrition of local food supplies, livestock, and a breakdown in social organization. The Confederacy's invasion of Columbus by Leonidas Polk ended Kentucky's policy of neutrality and turned it against the Confederacy. Using river transport and Andrew Foote's gunboats of the Western Flotilla, Grant threatened the Confederacy's Gibraltar of the West at Columbus, Kentucky. Although initially rebuffed at Belmont, Grant eventually cut off Columbus. With the Confederates lacking their gunboats, they were forced to retreat, leading to the Union's control of western Kentucky and opening of Tennessee in March 1862. In the Battle of Shiloh, fought in Shiloh, Tennessee in April 1862, the Confederates made a surprise attack that pushed Union forces against the river as night fell. Overnight, the Navy landed additional reinforcements, and Grant counterattacked. Grant and the Union achieved a decisive victory, marking the first battle with high casualty rates that would repeat over and over. The Confederates lost Albert Sidney Johnston, considered their finest general before the emergence of Lee. To sever the Confederacy in half, capturing the Mississippi River was one of the Union's early objectives in the war. The Union first took Island No. 10 and New Madrid, Missouri, and then Memphis, Tennessee, opening the Mississippi River to Union traffic to the southern border of Tennessee. In April 1862, the Union Navy captured New Orleans, which was deemed the key to the river and the South's largest port and industrial center. The Confederate defenses south of New Orleans were bypassed by U.S. naval forces under Farragut, and Confederate forces abandoned the city, giving the Union a critical anchor in the Deep South. This allowed Union forces to begin moving up the Mississippi, with Memphis falling to Union forces on June 6, 1862. Memphis became a key base for further advances south along the Mississippi River, with only Vicksburg, Mississippi, preventing Union control of the entire river. In the Confederate Heartland Offensive, Bragg's second invasion of Kentucky included initial successes, such as Kirby Smith's triumph at the Battle of Richmond and the capture of the Kentucky capital of Frankfort on September 3, 1862. However, the campaign ended with a meaningless victory over Major General Don Carlos Buell at the Battle of Perryville. Due to lack of logistical support and infantry recruits for the Confederacy in Kentucky, Bragg was forced to end his attempt at invading Kentucky and retreat. Bragg was narrowly defeated by Major General William Rosecrans at the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee, which was the culmination of the Stones River campaign. Assisted by naval forces, Ulysses S. Grant led the long and complex Vicksburg campaign in the West, culminating in the Confederate surrender at the Battle of Vicksburg in July 1863. This surrender solidified Union control over the Mississippi River and is regarded as one of the turning points of the war. The Battle of Chickamauga was the sole clear victory for the Confederacy in the West. Following the success of the Tullahoma campaign, Major General William Rosecrans was defeated by General Braxton Bragg, who had been reinforced by Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps from the Eastern Army, despite the brave defensive efforts of Major General George Henry Thomas. Rosecrans retreated to Chattanooga, which Bragg then besieged in the Chattanooga campaign. Grant arrived to relieve Rosecrans and defeated Bragg in the Third Battle of Chattanooga, forcing Longstreet to abandon his Knoxville campaign and driving Confederate forces out of Tennessee, opening a pathway to Atlanta and the Confederacy's heartland. The Trans-Mississippi Theater encompasses military operations west of the Mississippi River, including most of Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. To better coordinate command of troops in this area, the Confederate Army formed the Trans-Mississippi District, which included Ben McCulloch's command in Arkansas and Louisiana, Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard, and a portion of Earl Van Dorn's command that excluded the Army of the West. The Union's command in this region was the Trans-Mississippi Division or the Military Division of West Mississippi. The first battle of this theater was the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861, but the Confederates were eventually driven out of Missouri due to the Battle of Pea Ridge. Guerrilla warfare characterized the Trans-Mississippi region, as the Confederacy lacked the troops and resources to support regular armies that could challenge Union control. Confederate groups such as Quantrill's Raiders engaged in extensive raiding and terrorized the countryside, targeting military installations and civilian settlements alike. The Sons of Liberty and Order of the American Knights also attacked pro-Union people, elected officials, and unarmed uniformed soldiers. These partisans proved difficult to remove from Missouri until an entire regular Union infantry division was engaged. By 1864, their violent activities had hurt the anti-war movement, and despite these challenges, Missouri remained in the Union and Lincoln won 70% of the vote for re-election. The Union launched numerous small-scale military operations in the Southern and Western territories to gain control over Indian Territory and New Mexico Territory. The Battle of Glorieta Pass was the critical engagement in the New Mexico campaign, where the Union successfully repelled Confederate incursions and forced the exiled Arizona government to withdraw to Texas. In Indian Territory, tribal civil war broke out, with about 12,000 Indian warriors fighting for the Confederacy and smaller numbers for the Union. Brigadier General Stand Watie, the most prominent Cherokee leader, was the last Confederate general to surrender. Following the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, General Kirby Smith in Texas was left without further assistance from east of the Mississippi River. Despite lacking the resources to defeat Union armies, he established a strong arsenal at Tyler and created a virtual independent fiefdom with his own economy and railroad construction, as well as engaging in international smuggling. The Union did not directly engage him, and their 1864 Red River campaign to take Shreveport, Louisiana failed, leaving Texas in Confederate hands for the duration of the war. The Lower Seaboard Theater refers to military and naval operations that took place in the coastal areas of the Southeast region, including Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas, as well as the southern portion of the Mississippi River, with Union naval activities being directed by the Anaconda Plan. The first battle in this theater occurred in November 1861 at Port Royal Sound, located south of Charleston. The Union's efforts to capture Charleston concentrated on two approaches, by land over James or Morris Islands or through the harbor. The Confederates, however, were able to repel each Union attack. One of the most famous land battles was the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, in which the 54th Massachusetts Infantry participated. Although the Union suffered a significant defeat, losing 1,515 soldiers while the Confederates only lost 174, the 54th was hailed for its valor, which helped to encourage the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army, reinforcing the Union's numerical advantage. The Union Navy also targeted Fort Pulaski on the Georgia coast early on. Following the capture of Port Royal, an expedition led by Captain Quincy A. Gilmore and his engineer troops forced the Confederate surrender of Fort Pulaski, which the Union Army occupied for the rest of the war after repairing it. In April of 1862, a Union naval force led by Commander David D. Porter launched an attack on Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which guarded the river approach to New Orleans from the south. While some ships bombarded the forts, others broke through obstructions in the river, allowing the rest of the fleet to advance upriver towards the city. A Union army under Major General Benjamin Butler landed near the forts and compelled their surrender. However, Butler's harsh and controversial rule of New Orleans earned him the moniker Beast. In the subsequent year, Major General Nathaniel P. Banks led the Union Army of the Gulf in a nearly 8-week-long siege of Port Hudson, the longest in United States military history. Despite Confederate attempts to defend against the Union's Bayou Teche campaign, they ultimately surrendered following the fall of Vicksburg, which gave the Union control over the entire Mississippi River. While there were several minor skirmishes in Florida, there were no major battles aside from the Battle of Olustee in early 1864. The Pacific Coast Theater refers to military operations that occurred in the states and territories west of the Continental Divide, as well as on the Pacific Ocean. In 1864, President Lincoln appointed General Grant as commander of all Union armies. Grant, together with Sherman and Lincoln, believed that only the total defeat of Confederate forces and their economic base could end the war. They implemented a total war strategy, which involved taking provisions, forage, and destroying homes, farms, and railroads, which would otherwise support the rebellion. Grant created a coordinated strategy to attack the entire Confederacy from multiple directions. He ordered Generals Meade and Butler to move against Lee near Richmond, Sigel, and later Sheridan to attack the Shenandoah Valley, Sherman to capture Atlanta and march to the sea, Crook and Averill to operate against railroad supply lines in West Virginia, and Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama. Grant's army launched the overland campaign to draw Lee into a defense of Richmond, intending to pin down and destroy the Confederate army. The Union Army fought several battles, including the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. Lee's Confederates fell back repeatedly, and the Confederates lost Jeb Stuart at the Battle of Yellow Tavern. An attempt to outflank Lee from the south failed under Butler, who was trapped inside the Bermuda Hundred River Bend. Despite setbacks, Grant remained tenacious and kept pressing Lee's Army of Northern Virginia back to Richmond. When Lee was preparing for an attack on Richmond, Grant unexpectedly turned south to cross the James River and began the siege of Petersburg, which lasted for over 9 months and involved trench warfare. General Philip Sheridan was finally found by Grant as a commander aggressive enough to succeed in the Valley campaigns of 1864. At first, Sheridan was repelled by former U.S. Vice President and Confederate General John C. Breckinridge at the Battle of New Market, which was the last major victory for the Confederacy in the war and featured a charge by teenage VMI cadets. However, after increasing his efforts, Sheridan went on to defeat Major General Jubilee early in a series of battles, culminating in a decisive victory at the Battle of Cedar Creek. Sheridan then employed a tactic similar to Sherman's in Georgia, destroying the agricultural base of the Shenandoah Valley. In the meantime, Sherman moved from Chattanooga to Atlanta, defeating Confederate generals Joseph E. Johnston and John Bell Hood along the way. The fall of Atlanta on September 2, 1864, ensured Lincoln's re-election. Hood then threatened Sherman's supply lines and invaded Tennessee in the Franklin-Nashville campaign. However, Union Major General John Schofield defeated Hood at the Battle of Franklin, and George H. Thomas destroyed Hood's army at the Battle of Nashville. Leaving Atlanta and his base of supplies, Sherman's army marched with no particular destination, devastating about 20% of the farms in Georgia on his march to the sea. He arrived at the Atlantic Ocean in Savannah, Georgia, in December 1864, with his army being trailed by thousands of freed slaves. The march had no major battles, and Sherman subsequently turned north through South Carolina and North Carolina, approaching the Confederate Virginia lines from the south and intensifying the pressure on Lee's army. Lee's army, which had been depleted by desertion and casualties, was significantly smaller than Grant's forces. In a final attempt to break the Union's hold on Petersburg, the Confederates launched an attack at the decisive Battle of Five Forks on April 1, which is sometimes referred to as the Waterloo of the Confederacy. However, this attack failed, and as a result, the Union was able to gain control of the entire perimeter surrounding Richmond-Petersburg, effectively cutting it off from the Confederacy. With the realization that the capital was now lost, Lee made the decision to evacuate his army. The Union XXV Corps, which was composed of black troops, was responsible for capturing the Confederate capital. The remaining Confederate units were forced to flee west after their defeat at Sailor's Creek. Lee initially did not plan to surrender and intended to regroup at Appomattox Station, where supplies were waiting, and continue fighting. However, Grant pursued Lee and blocked his path, surrounding his army when they reached Appomattox Courthouse. After a futile battle, Lee concluded that further fighting was hopeless and surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia on April 9, 1865, at Wilmer McLean's farmhouse, also known as the McLean House. Grant respected Lee and allowed him to keep his sword and horse, Traveler. Lee's men were paroled, and other Confederate forces across the South surrendered as news of Lee's surrender spread. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Andrew Johnson, the vice president, was sworn in as president. The largest surrender of Confederate forces occurred on April 26, 1865, when General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered nearly 90,000 troops to Major General William Tecumseh Sherman at Bennett Place near present-day Durham, North Carolina. On May 10, 1865, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured in Irwinsville, Georgia. The final land battle of the war, the Battle of Palmito Ranch in Texas, was fought on May 13, 1865. The Confederate Trans-Mississippi Department forces surrendered on May 26, 1865, when Confederate Lt. Gen. Simon B. Buckner signed a military convention on behalf of General Edmund Kirby Smith. Historians and contemporaries often cite this date as the end of the American Civil War. On June 2, 1865, General Kirby Smith had little choice but to sign the official surrender document, despite most of his troops having already gone home. The last Confederate general to surrender his forces was Cherokee leader and Confederate Brigadier General Stand Watie, on June 23, 1865. On June 19, 1865, Union Major General Gordon Granger announced General Order No. 3, which brought the Emancipation Proclamation into effect in Texas, freeing the last slaves of the Confederacy. Today, the anniversary of this date is celebrated as Juneteenth. The naval portion of the war ended more gradually. President Lincoln issued a proclamation on April 11, 1865, stating that foreign nations had no further claim or pretense to deny U.S. warships equality of maritime rights and hospitalities. 2 days later, after no response from foreign nations, President Andrew Johnson issued a similar proclamation, stating that insurgent cruisers still at sea and prepared to attack U.S. ships should not have rights to use safe foreign ports or waters. He also directed U.S. officers to arrest the cruisers and their crews. England finally responded on June 6, 1865, withdrawing rights to Confederate warships to enter British ports and waters, with limited exceptions. On October 18, 1865, England advised that all measures of a restrictive nature on U.S. warships in British ports, harbors, and waters were at an end. Nonetheless, the final Confederate surrender was in Liverpool, England, where James Iredell Waddell surrendered the CSS Shenandoah to British authorities on November 6, 1865. President Andrew Johnson issued a proclamation on August 20, 1866, declaring that the said insurrection is at an end and that peace, order, tranquility, and civil authority now exist in and throughout the whole of the United States of America, officially marking the end of the war from a legal perspective. There is ongoing debate among historians about the causes and outcomes of the American Civil War, as well as its name. The economic disparity between the North and West, which grew prosperous, and the once rich South, which remained impoverished for a century, marked a significant change in the national political power structure. While the post-war Reconstruction period ended slavery, it failed to adequately address the second-class citizenship and poverty of freed slaves. Some historians have questioned whether the Confederacy could have won the war. While most scholars, including James M. McPherson, believe that Northern victory was likely due to the North's advantage in population and resources, McPherson acknowledges that a Confederate victory was possible. He suggests that the Confederacy could have won by using unconventional tactics and fighting defensively to make the cost of victory too high for the North. The Confederacy did not need to conquer enemy territory but only needed to hold out long enough to convince the North that victory was too costly. Lincoln's ability to continue the war depended on the support of the American public, as he was not a military dictator. The Confederacy sought to outlast Lincoln, but after the fall of Atlanta and Lincoln's defeat of McClellan in the 1864 election, the possibility of a political victory for the South vanished. Lincoln had secured the support of the Republicans, war Democrats, border states, emancipated slaves, and the neutrality of Britain and France. By defeating the Democrats and the Copperheads, who sought a negotiated peace with the Confederacy, Lincoln effectively secured his position as the leader of a united United States. There is ongoing debate among scholars about the reasons for the Union's victory over the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Some argue that the Union's industrial strength and larger population gave it an insurmountable advantage, with Confederate actions only delaying defeat. Civil War historian Shelby Foote succinctly expressed this view, arguing that the North fought the war with one hand behind its back and could have easily brought out the other hand if needed. However, most historians reject the idea that the Confederacy lost due to a lack of willpower. They point to the strong patriotism of Confederate soldiers and their belief that they were fighting for freedom and liberty. Despite the visible collapse of the Confederacy in 1864–65, Confederate soldiers continued to fight hard. Other factors that contributed to the Union victory included Lincoln's eloquence in rationalizing the national purpose and his ability to keep the border states committed to the Union cause. The Emancipation Proclamation was an effective use of the president's war powers, and the Confederate government's attempts to get European powers involved in the war were unsuccessful. Lincoln's naval blockade of southern ports and cities was highly effective at stopping trade, with imports and exports to the South declining significantly. Additionally, the abundance of European cotton and Britain's hostility to slavery, along with Lincoln's naval blockades, decreased the likelihood of European intervention in the war. According to historian Don Doyle, the Union victory in the Civil War had a significant impact on world history by energizing popular democratic forces. He argues that a Confederate victory would have resulted in a new birth of slavery and repression rather than freedom. Another historian, Fergus Bordwich, agrees with Doyle, stating that the North's victory proved the durability of democratic government and prevented the establishment of an American model for reactionary politics and race-based repression that would have had an international impact for years to come. The impact of the war on political and economic power in the South is still debated by scholars. While the prevailing view is that the Southern planter elite maintained their powerful position, a 2017 study challenges this perspective. The study suggests that the turmoil of the 1860s created greater opportunities for economic mobility in the South than in the North, although some Southern elites did retain their economic status. The American Civil War resulted in significant casualties, with at least 1,030,000 individuals affected, which was around 3% of the population. This number includes 620,000 soldier deaths, of which two-thirds were caused by disease, and 50,000 civilian deaths. However, historian J. David Hacker from Binghamton University argues that the number of soldier deaths was higher than traditionally estimated, possibly around 750,000 to 850,000. Another study, which examined census data, found that between 627,000 and 888,000 people died during the war, with the most likely number being 761,000. The war had a significant impact on the population, with 8% of all white men aged 13 to 43 dying in the conflict, including 6% in the North and 18% in the South. Approximately 56,000 soldiers died in prison camps, while an estimated 60,000 lost limbs in the war. Of the 359,528 Union Army deaths, which constituted 15% of the over 2 million who served, 110,070 were killed in action or died of wounds, 199,790 died of disease, 75% of which was war-related, 24,866 died in Confederate prison camps, 9,058 were killed by accidents or drowning, and 15,741 were classified as other or unknown deaths. The Navy also saw 4,523 deaths, 2,112 in battle, while the Marines had 460 deaths, 148 in battle. The war's cost in American lives was greater than all other wars combined through Vietnam, according to historian McPherson. After the Emancipation Proclamation allowed freed slaves to join the Union Army, former slaves who fled plantations or were liberated by Union forces joined the United States Colored Troops regiments, alongside black men who had never been enslaved. These troops, who comprised 10% of the Union's death toll, suffered losses disproportionately due to disease, with 15% dying from it, and less than 3% dying in battle. African American troops had a mortality rate higher than white soldiers, with approximately 20% of all African Americans enrolled in the military dying during the war, compared to 15.2% of United States volunteers and just 8.6% of white regular Army troops. According to the United States National Park Service's official tally of war losses, the Union lost 853,838 individuals, with 110,100 killed in action, 224,580 dying from disease, 275,154 wounded in action, and 211,411 captured, including 30,192 who died as POWs. The Confederacy lost 914,660 individuals, with 94,000 killed in action, 164,000 dying from disease, 194,026 wounded in action, and 462,634 captured, including 31,000 who died as POWs. The commonly cited figures of 360,000 Army deaths for the Union and 260,000 for the Confederacy are incomplete due to missing records and the fact that troops who died after being discharged were not counted. Confederate records were particularly affected, as Confederate widows were ineligible for benefits and thus did not report deaths. Francis Amasa Walker estimated a minimum of 500,000 Union military deaths and 350,000 Confederate military deaths, for a total death toll of 850,000 soldiers, using census and Surgeon General data. Although Walker's estimates were originally dismissed due to the 1,870 censuses undercounting, later research showed that the census was only off by 6.5% and that the data Walker used would be roughly accurate. Furthermore, an analysis of the number of dead using census data to calculate the deviation of the death rate of men of fighting age from the norm suggests that at least 627,000 and at most 888,000 soldiers died in the war, with a most likely estimate of 761,000. This breakdown suggests that approximately 350,000 Confederate and 411,000 Union military deaths occurred, based on the proportion of Union to Confederate battle losses. Estimating the number of deaths among former slaves has proven difficult due to the lack of reliable census data at the time. However, it is known that tens to hundreds of thousands of slaves died during the war from disease, starvation, or exposure, as they were set free or escaped in massive numbers in an area where the Union Army lacked sufficient shelter, doctors, or food for them. According to University of Connecticut professor Jim Downs, if these deaths are included in the war's total, the death toll would exceed 1 million. Compared to the recent defeat of Mexico, which saw roughly 13,000 American deaths, including fewer than 2,000 killed in battle, between 1846 and 1848, losses during the Civil War were far higher. One reason for the high number of battle deaths during the war was the continued use of tactics similar to those of the Napoleonic Wars at the turn of the century, such as charging. However, with the advent of more accurate rifled barrels, many balls, and, near the end of the war for the Union Army, repeating firearms such as the Spencer repeating rifle and the Henry repeating rifle, soldiers were mowed down when standing in lines in the open. This led to the adoption of trench warfare, which would define much of World War I. Initially, the Union did not have the goal of abolishing slavery, but it soon became a central objective. President Lincoln's initial stance was that preserving the Union was the primary aim of the war. On the other hand, the South viewed the conflict as a fight to maintain slavery. While not all Southerners held this belief, most of Lee's Army's officers and more than a third of its rank and file had close family ties to slavery. Conversely, Northerners were primarily focused on preserving the Union, with little regard for abolishing slavery. However, as the war continued, it became apparent that slavery was a critical aspect of the conflict and that emancipation was necessary to suppress the rebellion, leading Lincoln and his cabinet to prioritize ending slavery as a war goal, culminating in the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation drew the ire of both peace Democrats, Copperheads, and war Democrats, but it energized most Republicans. Democrats tried to gain political advantage by warning that free blacks would flood the North, leading to gains in the 1862 elections, but they failed to gain control of Congress. Meanwhile, the Republicans' argument that slavery was the backbone of the enemy gained traction, resulting in a significant defeat for the Democrats in the 1863 Ohio elections when they tried to stir up anti-black sentiment. When Union armies arrived in areas held by the Confederacy's 3.5 million black slaves, their enslavement effectively ended, and nearly all were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. The last Confederate slaves were emancipated on June 19, 1865, now celebrated as Juneteenth. Slaves in the border states and some former Confederate territory occupied before the Emancipation Proclamation were freed by state action or by the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation also enabled African Americans, both free blacks and escaped slaves, to enlist in the Union Army, and about 190,000 volunteered, further strengthening the Union's numerical advantage over the Confederates, who were unable to do the same for fear of undermining the legitimacy of slavery. During the Civil War, views on slavery, enslavement, and emancipation were divided in the United States. Lincoln initially opposed making slavery a war issue, as abolition did not enjoy broad support in the Western territories and border states. He feared that premature attempts at emancipation could lead to the loss of the border states, which he considered crucial to winning the war. Some war Democrats and Copperheads opposed emancipation, but eventually accepted it as necessary to save the Union. Lincoln initially reversed attempts at emancipation by Secretary of War Simon Cameron and Generals John C. Fremont and David Hunter to keep the loyalty of the border states and war Democrats. He warned the border states that more radical emancipation measures would be implemented if his plan of gradual compensated emancipation and voluntary colonization was rejected. However, compensated emancipation only occurred in the District of Columbia, where Congress had the power to enact it. When Lincoln proposed his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Seward advised him to wait for a Union military victory before issuing it. Lincoln laid the groundwork for public support in an open letter to Horace Greeley and a meeting with 5 African American representatives at the White House. The Union's victory in the Battle of Antietam and the subsequent War Governors' Conference provided the necessary support for Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln released his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which announced that slaves in all states that were still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, would be set free. On that day, Lincoln fulfilled his promise by issuing the final Emancipation Proclamation. In a letter to Albert G. Hodges, Lincoln explained that he believed slavery was morally wrong, but as president, he did not have unrestricted power to act on his beliefs. He also admitted that events had often dictated his actions, rather than the other way around. Lincoln's moderate approach to emancipation was successful in persuading the border states to remain in the Union and war Democrats to support it. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, or Union-controlled regions such as New Orleans and Norfolk, Missouri and Maryland abolished slavery on their own. Kentucky and Delaware did not. However, some western states were unhappy with the proclamation, as they had racist sentiments and feared abolition, leading to unrest and concerns that they might secede. Since the Emancipation Proclamation was based on Lincoln's war powers, it only applied to territories under Confederate control. Nevertheless, it became a symbol of the Union's growing commitment to liberty, and its issuance greatly diminished the Confederacy's hope of gaining recognition or assistance from European nations. By late 1864, Lincoln was actively involved in the effort to get the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution passed, which would outlaw chattel slavery. The aftermath of the Civil War left the South in ruins, prompting difficult questions about how to reintegrate it into the Union. The war obliterated much of the South's wealth, rendering Confederate bonds, banks, and railroads bankrupt. The per capita income in the South fell to less than 40% of the North's, which lasted for decades. Additionally, Southern influence in the federal government diminished considerably until the latter half of the 20th century. Reconstruction efforts began during the war and continued until 1877, with the goal of consolidating the Union's victory, guaranteeing a republican form of government for the ex-Confederate states, ending slavery, and preventing semi-slavery status. The 3 Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution were enacted to achieve these objectives, including the 13th, which outlawed slavery in 1865, the 14th, which granted citizenship to slaves in 1868, and the 15th, which ensured voting rights for slaves in 1870. President Johnson took a lenient approach and believed that the main war goals had been achieved when each ex-rebel state repudiated secession and ratified the 13th Amendment in 1865. However, radical Republicans demanded proof that Confederate nationalism was dead and that the slaves were genuinely free. They overrode Johnson's vetoes of civil rights legislation, and the House impeached him, although the Senate did not convict him. Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican candidate, won the presidency in 1868 and 1872. The liberal Republicans argued that the war goals had been achieved, and Reconstruction should end in 1872. In 1874, Southern Democrats took control of Congress and opposed further Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction, with a national consensus that the Civil War had finally ended. However, with the withdrawal of federal troops, whites took back control of every Southern legislature, and the Jim Crow era of disenfranchisement and legal segregation began. The impact of the Civil War on American politics was significant, with many veterans from both sides subsequently elected to political office, including 5 U.S. presidents: General Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley.